Welcome to In the Green Chair, an interview podcast series for people looking to begin or expand their career in the green economy. I'm your host, Anna, and on this episode, we sit down with Allie Rougeot, a youth climate activist who is an organizer with Fridays for Future Toronto.
There's a big difference between empowering youth and saying, thank you for your work, and saying, the youth want to handle this. The youth have said that they're the leaders of tomorrow, they want to handle this. We really want everybody to take care of this. We've taken the leadership role because there was a leadership void. We'll do the work because it has to be done, but we'd rather share the burden.
She has been named one of Starfish Canada's 25 top environmental leaders under 25, and Allie currently works as a climate and energy program manager for Environmental Defence Canada. On this episode, we talk about what climate activism is and how you can adopt the role, no matter your background or occupation. So without further ado, let's get to it. Welcome to the Green Chair, Allie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Anna.
So I wanted to get started by touching upon a topic that we discussed in our previous conversation, where you shared with me that a commonly held belief that you passionately disagree with about youth climate advocacy is that it's regarded as a hobby. Why do you believe this, and why is it something that bothers you?
Pretending like it's something that I just kind of do for fun just kind of discredits a lot of the work. That makes me quite upset for a few reasons. The first one is that it seems like they don't take the cause itself seriously. So, putting all ego aside, if you think that climate justice activism is a hobby, that means you think it doesn't actually really need to be done, right? It's just an optional thing. And given the state of the climate crisis and the state of the many injustices happening around the world, that's just really difficult to hear, not something I agree with. On top of that, I think it's harmful because it makes it sound like we're not sacrificing anything to do this work. And I'll just point out that for activists that do it really out of a almost like survival mechanism, so that's the case for frontline Indigenous peoples, that narrative is even more harmful to them because they are really like directly being threatened by the climate crisis and by other abuses to the environment. And so for them to hear that narrative is, I think, deeply disrespectful.
Of course, and narratives impact whether we act or not. So I wanted to take a step back from all of this. For those who may not know, what is it that you're advocating for, and why is it important?
So overall, I'm advocating for climate justice. Climate justice is the idea that we need to solve the climate crisis. We need to respond to it. We need to stop contributing to the greenhouse gas emission rise. And at the same time, the justice component is the idea that we also need to be addressing the many other injustices that are happening, either aside from the climate crisis or that are linked to it, or that might happen if we just take climate action but don't address the justice issue. Some of the big demands we have are Canada having to lower its greenhouse gas emissions by phasing out of fossil fuels, by investing in energy efficiency, by putting funds into renewables. But it's also advocating for Indigenous sovereignty over their lands, or for the cleanup of communities, especially Black communities or racialized communities in Canada that have been affected by industry in the past. We're also advocating for labor rights. We believe that a fair planet is not only a planet that's sustainable, it's also a planet where people are paid for the work they do and they're paid well enough to live. So those are the types of issues that I try to move forward in my work.
Definitely, because at the end of the day, it's imperative and professional to show up. And at the root of all of this is that human connection and understanding that there is this grave problem. Climate change is a humanitarian problem. The question that floats around is, how do you determine or define that difference between advocacy work versus being seen as an unpaid volunteer? And also, if you don't mind sharing, are you paid for all the work that you do? And is that something that matters to you and something that you've noticed matters to other climate activists?
I don't think I can give you the distinction between advocacy and unpaid work, because a lot of the time that's what they are. They don't have to be, and perhaps they shouldn't be. For the Fridays for Future work I'm doing, so the school strikes and the many workshops and presentations and media, that's all unpaid work. And people often assume that it's at least partially covered by like foundations or grants, but none of us are paid in it. However, in most, maybe the last year, and I can't explain why, people have offered a few times compensation for me. So honorariums for speaking at things. I have since, though, since I graduated university, actually started working during the day at Environmental Defense, which is a nonprofit. And so I'm obviously paid there for my work. So it's interesting because my unpaid work led me to then getting a job. In the ideal world, we would all be compensated for all the work we do. And I say that, for climate work, but also maybe for all the care work you do and for all the service to community you do.
Yep. And I think either experiences, whether unpaid or paid, still gives you a lot of those skills that ultimately create that career path for you. Like you mentioned, your advocacy work led you to the work that you're doing at Environmental Defense. And following on those experiences, what training opportunities and education did you pursue growing up?
My formal education was first through the French school system. I grew up in France. And then at the University of Toronto doing economics and public policy, which brought me some understanding of the system and the world we live in, and mostly a lot of anger about that system. I sat in many economic classes where the professor would just show a slideshow that essentially just told me why we were underpaying workers and why we couldn't do anything about it, And so I think my formal education mostly motivated me to seek more informal education. As I joined movements, you get educated by peers in like a really strong way. I'm pretty sure I know about the climate crisis because I was involved in a local movement for refugee rights. And someone was like, yeah, and it's going to get worse with the climate crisis. And I was like, what's that? And then there we go, unravels a whole career of climate activism. So the training I got has been a lot through peers or people a little older in the movement, attending rallies. It's crazy, but attending demonstrations, rallies, protests, you have speakers all the time and you have people with signs. And like, if you start observing those, you're learning a lot.
We'll be right back. This interview series is part of the Green Collar Careers program, brought to you by Relay Education. Relay is a Canadian charity that delivers renewable energy, environmental education, and green careers programs for youth. Remember to check out our website, relayeducation.com, and social media channels at Relay Education to find out when our next interview will be posted and to find resources on how to start your green career. Allie, how far into the future are you looking ahead into your career? Do you see your career journey shifting significantly?
When I plan my career, when I think of my career, I'm like, okay, so in 10 years, if we've acted on the climate crisis enough that we're on the emissions reduction, then I really want to be working with communities to help them transition away from fossil fuels or things like that. I really want to be there. If we haven't acted, well, I guess I want to be protesting even harder. So if we're already seeing a huge amount of climate disaster, I guess I would work with the humanitarian aid and relief sector. So I almost have different scenarios, which makes it kind of hard to plan. So instead, I'm choosing not to be too strategic, and I just try to develop specific skills that I know I want. So right now, a lot of my work is dedicated to just working with other people, whether it's people from labor, people from communities, people from other organizations. And that's something I like to do. And so I'm trying to get better at understanding what they want out of a conversation, understanding how to get a better conversation flowing, things like that.
Yeah. And I guess when your work is so focused on climate change, that it's such a changing topic, so does the work that you do. And ultimately, though, I think all jobs are going to be impacted in different extents. I know you mentioned earlier on how you pursued work after graduation. How did you navigate those varying interests in finding a job straight after graduation or pursuing further education?
It was a big question. When I started university, I thought, I have to do a master's after. That's what everybody told me. People said, an undergrad is good, but got to go further. Because of the pandemic and because of some of my frustrations with the academic world, I was thinking, how much more am I going to do this, studying only? And I knew that a master's would maybe mean that I couldn't do as much activism because perhaps it would just take up more of my time. So in all cases, I kind of questioned it and I started looking for jobs. It's actually funny, but I had initially thought, oh, I'm not going to work for a nonprofit now because I know that's where I'll end up eventually. And so I'd like to first seek another experience and then I get to go to the nonprofit world and really expand there and use my skills. But then when I saw the job posting that for the job that I now have, I read the description. I was like, oh, I would really love to do all these things. Like all of these tasks sounded cool. And I was like, well, whatever, I'll just apply. Probably won't get it anyways. And then I got it and I was like, well, guess this is it. So it was really not a strategy, but it was much more like looking at each part and thinking, I like to do that. I'd like to get better at that. Let's give it a try.
Yeah, and questioning that conventional thinking that you have to do this after graduation and follow this straight linear path. Like your career path can change so much. And who knows, maybe return back to education later on.
I hope I will. I think I will actually. But I hope I will once I've identified a clear need for it instead of just doing it as an automatic. You're not worth enough if you haven't gotten to a graduate level.
What specifically attracted you to the job posting?
I liked the job because first of all, I tackled two issues around climate and energy questions that were some that I was already interested in. The first one being, how do we transition workers and communities currently reliant on really polluting industries? How do we transition them to a non-polluting economy? So I thought that was interesting. And then the second one was, how do we clean up the mess that some of the industry has been putting out there in communities, and especially in racialized and Indigenous communities? So the topics appealed right away to me. And then the tasks were engage with other members of the community, engage with governments, engage with the media, engage with the public. A lot of communicating, I guess, almost translating knowledge from reports that I'm reading into things that are going to make people act. I like the fact that a lot of my work is in many ways supporting others. I think in my youth advocacy, I'm often the one that gets supported. I like that in this role, I'm way more going to Indigenous-led groups and saying, hey, how can we support you? Yeah, it's really about learning a different role that you can play. You can play both at once. That's what I'm still doing.
Do you change your advocacy approach when you meet with governments or politicians?
As a youth activist, I would go out and say, I want more climate action. And I think that's what youth are allowed to do, is they don't need to know the policy solutions. They don't need to be policy experts. They go out there and say, what I want is climate action. In my job, though, my role is actually to know the policies. My job is to think about those things so that when I go to government, I have strong arguments and I actually have solutions to point to. So I guess that the content is different in that sense.
When advocating and doing the advocacy work, what have you noticed that works and what are some of the pitfalls?
What works well, I believe, is speaking about your personal story first, explaining why you care. Because what you need to do is have people that end up caring as much as you do, or at least enough to take action, right? And so by sharing your personal story, you might actually give them elements of response. It's important to note that not everybody's going to care about your story. Some people are going to think that has nothing to do with my life. And so that's also why it's important to have many different stories that inform it. But definitely the storytelling, this personal connection to the cause helps quite a bit. Relying on others, working together with others helps a lot. And I mean others, not only, other youth, and we should all be organizing together just so that we don't burn out, but also across sectors, across generations. Last weekend, we organized a rally with some people from the labor movement, some people from movements that are, representing parents or grandparents concerned about the climate crisis, some Indigenous communities, some people that are like from the education movement, or trying to improve quality of education and that also care about the climate crisis. And we came together and we organized a rally. And I think that's an area where there's a lot of success, because nothing is scarier to a politician that doesn't want to act on the climate crisis than a very organized community, right? A very like solidarity community. So that's one of the big ones. The pitfall, well, there are many. I think one of them is that sometimes we get so into the specific action we're trying to do or the specific branding of our group that we might forget the bigger cause. And so I think the climate strike movement sometimes is at risk of that. If we continue just saying we have to have a climate strike every few months, there's a climate strike, that's the way it is, but we forget like to adapt to local situations, or if we get to like rethink strategies when they don't work, then we're losing.
Exactly. And I really resonate with what you said about that there's so many issues revolving around climate change. It is that the classic term, the wicked problem. It's the social components, economic components, the political side. There's so much. And another pitfall that I've also commonly heard is that some people may say that they don't have time for advocacy work, or that it can't be a priority for them. And in our last conversation, you also shared your belief that you shouldn't stop being an activist despite the role that you are in. What did you mean by that?
It's true that some people have too much going on in their lives. I mean, I'm thinking about people that have children, or that are taking care of their elderly parents or community members, and that have a job, and that have their own lives that they want to continue living. It's difficult. And so what I mean is really to, instead of trying to invent a time in your really busy schedule to be an activist in like this new way, you just should try to identify roles within your existing schedule that can make you an activist. A teacher is, to me, like the best example. A teacher or someone that is in frequent contact with youth, they can start by having the conversation about the climate crisis. You have to say that's not taboo, and we have to talk about the fact that we're not doing well right now on our planet, but that we can do better. We need to actually get our act together. So doing that, if you're a parent, it's bringing it at the dinner table. If you are a member of anything from a reading club to a sports club to any sort of hobby-based community, that means people probably like trust you and know you. And so that's the best moment to start bringing up climate change. So that's really what I mean in some ways, is that you don't have to like just become the megaphone holding activist. You can become an activist in the spheres you already evolve in. There's another part of that though. Some people will decide, okay, I care about the climate crisis. Maybe they were an activist, and then they join a job that has some form of like sustainability branding on it. They might be in a big bank and they're in the sustainability department, or they might be on a school board and they're responsible for the environment outreach program. In all cases, sometimes people will kind of forget where they came from and the initial passion, because their job title now kind of like says, I'm taking care of this. I'm doing my part on the climate front. And I find that really sad. We need you to continue pushing even once you've entered those roles. We need you to, sure, you're on the sustainability team, but why not try to make sure the sustainability team is aligned with the supply chain team? So always trying to push, always realizing that until we are in a climate safe planet, your job is not done. And so that's kind of my call in for people that sometimes forget where they come from once they get the sustainability job, is not to forget that you should still be an activist, or at least an advocate in all of these roles that you hold.
And to push that even further, because you can apply advocacy work in almost anything that you do, no matter what your background, and whether it be your internship, small business, or within your company. How do you define success when it comes to advocacy work? How can someone do it right, or how can someone maybe do it wrong?
A few good indicators is it tangibly addressing either one of the climate parts of the issue or one of the justice parts of the issue, or ideally both? Actually, the ideal would always be looking at both. So if you are part of a group and you've had this great idea of a really like climate oriented program, but it's actually only kind of like a conversation with people of the same sector, and there's actually no reduction in greenhouse gases, or there's no solutions oriented action, well, I guess you're just kind of patting yourself on the back, but you're not doing anything. So I really think like measure the outcomes. Try to be a little, sometimes it's being a little harsh with yourself, but measure the outcomes. Certainly, I think one of the wrong ways to do it, it's complicated to use that word, is to kind of go head on with one solution that you like heard about, and not allow yourself to be challenged or challenge your own thinking.
Like connecting with your peers and just deciding to reach out and talk to different people, you'll be surprised by how much you learn. It's no doubt that social media plays a huge role in bringing different youth organizations and leaders together when it comes to climate advocacy. How can people manage that massive amount of information available to them to get started and also avoid that decision fatigue that comes with it?
Social media to me is the fossil fuels of this new era. The first thing someone should do is use it with moderation at least. And I know it's really hard, but really think of it as the fossil fuels of this era, or the tobacco of this era, in the sense that it has powerful and dangerous side effects, and including for our planet. The footprint of the internet is huge. The greenhouse gas emissions that come from some of the climate activism I do online, there's a bit of a contradiction there. Doesn't mean I shouldn't do it, just means you have to do it with moderation and when needed, I'd say. My advice to people when they deal with like a ton of information through social media and having to constantly like figure out, do I care? Do I want to engage with this? Is I guess trying to set intentions ahead of time on like what you want to get out of it. If you're going there for actual information, then act like you're going there for information. Look at credible sources. Check your sources, actually read the whole post before you're going back. And so I think it's just like, let's be honest with yourself. Are you doing it as a like passive way of saying, oh, I'm doing my activism, or I'm doing my education? Or are you actually doing it with the intention of learning?
Yeah, and I can't help but to connect it back to when we were talking about how just because you have an environmental title to the job that you do doesn't mean that you are doing environmental work or to the best of your ability. It's all about that intention and not being passive, being an action taker. Is there anything else that you would like to leave our listeners with?
One element that I believe I brought up a little bit, but that is important to remember for me, is this is work that everybody can do and should do, adapted to who you are. And so, yes, really try to find the roles in your life where you can be more of a climate advocate, and also really staying away from the idea that the youth are taking care of it. There's a big difference between empowering youth and saying, thank you for your work. Here is some of my money or energy, or I'm inviting you to speak to my book club or things like that. And saying, the youth want to handle this. The youth have said that they're the leaders of tomorrow. They want to handle this. We really want everybody to take care of this. We've taken the leadership role because there was a leadership void, not because we wanted at 16, 20, and 25 to start thinking about existential things. So that's really my big plea to folks is, don't leave it up to us. We'll do the work because it has to be done, but we'd rather share the burden.
Allie, thank you so much for joining us today in the Green Chair. It's been an absolute pleasure. How can people connect with you and find out more about the work that you do?
I encourage people to first connect with Fridays for Future Toronto, which is the group I organize with. And that's just, if you look Fridays for Future Toronto on all social media platforms, you'll find them. And then if you do want to reach out to me directly, I'm very happy to answer questions and like actually help people find groups that they can organize with. And so I believe it would just be Allie Rougeot on all social media platforms, and you should be able to find me there. And I really encourage you to reach out if you want to.
Thank you for sitting down with us today in the Green Chair. We hope you enjoyed learning about how climate justice activism is more about finding an opportunity in your existing schedule rather than carving out more time. It's in your hands to bring up the topic among your peers and to make everyday environmentally conscious decisions. Once again, I'm your host, Anna, and stay tuned for our next episode to learn more about the different paths people take to working in the green economy.